I'm Ben Balter. I'm with GitHub. I'm their government evangelist, which means that my role is just to make sure that when government agencies want to take their first or second step into the world of open source, that they have a good experience, that the open source community has a good experience, and that ultimately that everyone involved is successful. And so when I started about 2 or 3 years ago, the conversation in the open gov community was, what is open source and why should we care? And over the past couple years, I think that's really shifted less so to what is open source and more so to everyone's talking about open source. All the talks here say, go check out GitHub for the code, but I don't know how to do that successfully. So I'm hoping to spend some time today talking through 10 patterns or anti-patterns of what I've seen in open source projects in government and how you can do them or avoid them to be most successful. If that sounds like fun and something interesting and making sure that you're in the right room. Sound good? Awesome. And feel free, I want this to be interactive. I'm here to be as helpful as I can for you. So if I'm talking too slowly, for example, please feel free to raise your hand and let me know and interrupt me and shout out if you have any questions or anything like that. Sweet. All right. So if you fall asleep or if you leave early, there's 2 things to take away, the central thesis here. The first is that open source is not the same thing as published source, right? Simply taking code and putting it up in an FTP server and forgetting about it and never ever looking at it ever again does not make an open source project, right? Open source software is the concept of a software that anyone can and is able to modify a shared code base, right? That not only can I grab that code, but I have the right to do certain things with that, and I can modify it, right? And the idea is that it's open to everyone and that's open to anyone. But the idea of open source goes a little bit further than that. The idea of open source is not just that I have the right to modify that code, but I also there's this expectation that I have the right to propose changes to that code, that it's a discussion, that we can go back and forth, that there's a little bit more of a dialogue. And so you can take the idea of open source and abstract it into the idea of collaboration, where anyone can contribute to the project, whether it's source code, whether it's data, whether it's policy, whatever it might be. And what makes all that possible is version control, right? Git, SVN, perforce, subversion, whatever you might be using. The idea that there's some sort of software underlying all this that tracks who made what change when. If you're in an office context, you might be familiar with SharePoint, you might use Dropbox, whatever it is in the open source community, we use version control, and that's how you know that anyone in the world can propose a change, that you can accept that change, and your server is not going to explode and spiders come out of it because there's some sort of virus in it or something like that. Right? It gives you the confidence to know that what you're doing is safe, and makes these communication, this collaboration, this conversation possible. The second takeaway, if you fall asleep, is to optimize for developers, right? You can have open source without having executive oversight. You can have open source without having policy guidance. But you can't have open source without developers, and most importantly, you can't have open source without code. So lots of government agencies, or if you're in a brigade talking to a city, the first question you're gonna hear is, well, what's the governance for this, right? We need a 15-page policy document. And that's optimizing for the wrong thing. That's optimizing for the bureaucrats in government. And you can do that, and you're going to have a bad experience for all the things we talk about in a moment. Instead, I would argue that think through the user experience of what a developer might go through. Just like you might think through the user experience of a website, what is the developer experience of contributing to your open source project? Optimize for that, and force the government to absorb the complexity of that ideal experience in order to make it better for developers, even if that means it's a slightly harder burden on the side of government. So today I want to break out the best practices, the secrets, into 2 big categories. One for internal collaboration and one for external engagement. On the internal collaboration front, the idea here being is you can't come from a closed source mindset, right? You can't be entirely waterfall. You can't, have zip files flying around on CD-ROM drives and USB sticks and say, okay, we're going to go open source now, right? There has to be some sort of rethinking of the internal processes at the government agency, or if you're advising that government agency and helping them out, you need to go through and actually spend some time thinking through what the business workflows, the business processes work like before you make any changes. The first idea is that the technology is the easy part, right? It's not a question of can we put this in a Git repo. It's not a question of can we expose this on the internet. It's not a question of can we track who made what change when. These are all solved problems that the open source community literally solved decades ago, right? Instead, the challenge comes from the idea that you're really using open source as a vehicle for organizational change to rethink the relationship between the government agency and its citizens, and oftentimes between different business units within the government agency. And so the idea is that you can't be a closed source government agency with a closed source culture and then just kind of flip a bit to make a project public and assume all of a sudden you're gonna have this really, really great open source project. So the one fundamental thing you have to do is go through and start thinking about open source projects internally. Meaning projects that may never see the light of day, may never be publicly available, but you're running them like an open source project to get people used to the idea of sharing things more openly and to build the workflow and the processes necessary to support that. The second idea is to start small and go through the motions, right? I like to say that organizations have a muscle memory, right? And just kind of like our own muscle memory, you wouldn't just start running a marathon without first training for it. You would probably die. That'd be a really, really bad thing. Organizations also have that same muscle memory, and open source is that marathon, right? You can't just say, okay, we've never done open source ever any time before. We're doing this new big open source project. It's this big flagship initiative. It has a policy component. We're hoping to be on the front page of the New York Times for this. Our local, our mayor's coming in and he's going to hit commit to publish the repo. You can't do that, right? You are setting yourself up for failure because you have this whole giant organizational immune system that the one thing it's really good at is saying no. And every step of the way, it's going to start to say no, and you're going to get pushback on that. So if there's a high likelihood you're going to fail, right? There's a high likelihood that all these different kind of parts of the organization are going to recognize antibodies or see antibodies that they don't recognize and start saying no. Find something small that you know is not going to fail, that you know if it does fail, no one's going to care, and kind of go through the motions of that process, right? So maybe you can do something in private, like the best places to get lunch around your office, the best coffee shops, your family's chocolate chip cookie recipe. Do it in a private repo, and start getting non-developers involved. All the people in the kind of life cycle and open source project that you need to convince to get to yes. Legal, procurement, ethics, customer service, depending on what the project might be. If you're trying to convince an attorney that open source is safe and that GitHub is safe and that it's okay that members of the public are changing the code for the website, it's a lot easier to say, hey, remember when you submitted a pull request to add your grandmother's chocolate chip cookie recipe and I approved it? Just like that. I need to still approve it. We're still in control. Because we're talking about very abstract concepts, when you get down into the tangible, when you can give physical examples, things get a lot easier. And the last is to when I say start small, is you should be shipping 0.1, not 1.0, right? So the thing you get out the door for the first time shouldn't be this whole fancy new whiz-bang website, but maybe the wireframes for that website. Maybe that is the IA concepts, maybe some user experience testing you did. Again, find things that are very, very small so you can go through the motions and learn how to open source internally and then kind of scale up to that big kind of whiz-bang release that you want to do. The third best practice for internal collaboration is to minimize information imbalance. And what I mean by that is think about open source as growing a community, right? You have a community of stakeholders that care about your code or they care about the problem that your code is trying to solve, right? But developers are people too, something we often forget in government, right? Oftentimes, the stakeholders that are inside the firewall, inside the government agency, are the squeaky wheel, right? They have direct access, the project manager, the program manager, all the kind of stakeholders. There's a weekly meeting, maybe it's a status meeting, maybe it's a conference call. I want to know what's going on with the XYZ project. I get an email in my inbox every Monday, right? Whatever it might be, there's two different classes of contributors within this community, which creates an information imbalance, right? So maybe inside, I have access to roadmaps, I have access to additional documentation, I can just go and tap Bob on the shoulder and ask him his opinion on something. And then you have another developer outside the firewall that spends 3 weeks building an awesome pull request to add a feature that he thinks is awesome, and you get to it and you're like, oh yeah, we discussed this at the private meeting last week, sorry, we decided not to do this. That developer just wasted 3 weeks of his time, and you can bet that he's never or she's never going to contribute another pull request to your project. So the way you solve for that is you push everything outside the firewall. You work outside the firewall. You don't use any tools internally to collaborate that the rest of the community doesn't have access to. Put everyone on equal footing. What that means practically is that you have one issue tracker, right? It's not that you have the GitHub issue tracker outside in public and you have a Jira issue tracker internally that's the real issue tracker that's kind of what you give to your contractors. That you only have one way to provide feedback, right? So if someone emails the project manager and says, hey, Bob, I noticed that I clicked the sidebar and didn't do anything. I think this is a bug. Bob shouldn't then go and say, great, thank you very much, and do whatever. He should say, hey, it's on GitHub. Here's a link to the issue tracker. Do you mind opening an issue on that, right? All of a sudden then, everyone everyone starts to get on the same page. And if you do have to have conversations in meet space, conversations in person, this happens in government, it's still very much part of the culture, to try to minimize those, so not like a regularly scheduled meeting, or if you do have them, just memorialize them. Open up an issue, add something to a wiki that says, hey, we had a meeting, we brainstormed something, we felt that a higher fidelity medium would be more appropriate. This is the decision we made, and this is why we made it. Does anybody else have any thoughts? To at least kind of open it up to the broader community. I know kind of some baby steps that some agencies take. If they do have to have that weekly in-person meeting, they'll have a phone bridge and they'll publish the number to that phone bridge online. It's not ideal because if I'm in a different time zone halfway around the world, I still have to dial in, it's an international call, but it's at least a step in the right direction to try to minimize information imbalance. Day to day, that means filling out documentation so that I know, is this project actively developed, right? I know if I work at the agency, I know Susan got fired, so the project's dead. If I'm out in the community, I just don't see any commits. Communicate that. Basic stuff, how to submit an issue, how to contribute to the project, how to fix enhancement. And in the long term, and this is I think one of the most crucial parts that you rarely see in READMEs and project documentation, what are the long-term goals of the project? What are you actually trying to solve for? Are you trying to solve one specific thing and then you're going to shut down the project? Is this thing going to be funded through 2080? What's the philosophy? What are your requirements? What are your features? Do you have a wish list of things that you might want that I can contribute to? Again, just all those kind of things that are organizational knowledge, trying to memorialize them and push them outside the firewall as much as possible. Number 4, this is one of the, I think the most important and one of my favorite. It comes from a colleague of mine, one of the early GitHub engineers, Ryan Tomeko, who says that open source has certain constraints. Right? If you think about open source software is rarely 2 people working on the same thing at the same time, rarely in the same place at the same time, often not from very different cultures. And yet open source has empirically proved to create better software than its purpose-built and proprietary counterparts, right? So what from those constraints of open source, from the way that open source has to be built, can you then take kind of inside your firewall to work more like an open source project? And so he came up with 4 constraints. The first is he says that everything needs to be electronic, right? You use high fidelity mediums that naturally capture an exposed process. So that's chat, that's Slack, that's maybe not email if you have to use email, things like Google Groups, but that's not conference calls, right? That's not things that automatically capture everything. When things are electronic, it automatically then makes it so that other people can participate in the process. Second, everything in open source is transparent, right? Once you have everything captured in this electronic medium, every decision that's ever happened in any open source project has a URL. I can go to that URL, I can see why the decision was made, who argued for what the winning argument eventually was, so that when other people come into the project later on, all you have to do is send them a URL, and they see the project's status, the process around it, real time and going forward forever. Third is that it's asynchronous. Right? You don't have to have a meeting at 9 a.m. on Monday. If I'm in a different time zone, if I have a kid that I need to take to school, whatever it might be, I can do things asynchronous meaning they're not blocking. I don't have to require someone to sign a letter to let me open up a pull request. I can do things at my own pace and most importantly without the agency's permission, which is again just a feature of version control. There's no tapping someone on the shoulder and saying, hey, I have a question about this, because that interrupts them, and then again, people not part of that conversation. And last, and I think this is one of the most important if you forget about all the rest, is that it's informal. Right? When you get a pull request on GitHub, it's not, dear sir or madam, I'm in receipt of your pull request dated 27 October. It's like, yo dude, awesome pull request, emoji, animated GIF, right? It shows that you can be professional without being formal, right? And I think that's really the crux of open source, that people have a good time, people enjoy it, but it's not, racist, it's not, it's not people aren't being inappropriate. You're still professional, but you don't have to have that kind of rigidity. And that allows you to adopt more cultural constraints rather than policies and technical constraints. So there's certain features of kind of the GitHub and the open source community that yes, you have the permission to do it, right? Technically, I could submit a pull request to GitHub/GitHub, like github.com, that says, remove everything that's white and make it pink, whatever, something stupid like that. The reason I don't do that is not because I don't have the physical permission to change the background color, and also that it's a stupid idea, but the fact that I know if I did that, the rest of the community inside GitHub, of the kind of open source project, in quotes, that is github.com, would make fun of me, right? They're like, that's a stupid pull request. Don't do designing stuff. Go do government stuff. This is not for you. And so even though I have permission to access that part of the code base, I would never touch that part of the code base because of kind of those cultural constraints and those cultural norms. And the advantage of that is maybe I go and get a degree in design, and I'm a really great designer, or maybe pink's a popular color of 2016. Whatever it might be, I then am empowered to go submit that change when I know it's right without having to like ask someone and fill out a form and take a test and jump through all sorts of hoops. Those cultural constraints can change as the culture changes, where technical constraints can't change without human intervention. And the last of the internal kind of best practices is about when you open source the code, right? When you start sharing it outside your firewall. And the idea is that you should open source problems, not open source solutions. And oftentimes in government, we really like to do the latter. When developers get involved with a project, it's because they want to contribute to a cause, right? We have this philosophy in government that, oh, we'll put it up and we'll open source it, and a bunch of people will write the code for us for free, so we don't need to hire government contractors. It'll be awesome. That's not how open source works. If you approach it with that philosophy, you're not going to get really great results. The example that I like to use is you think of open source like a political campaign, right? People volunteer for political campaigns. We're heading into the 2016 campaign cycle. I'm doing the math wrong on this one, the 2012 and 2008 campaign cycles, President Obama's slogan was not, yes, we did. It wasn't, guys, I came up with a great plan to solve America, I implemented it, we're good, elected me president. Right? No one's going to volunteer for that campaign because there's not a cause for them to get behind. They're not something for them to contribute to. But the slogan there, politics aside, was, yes, we can. Please come help me. And that's the kind of implicit part of any open source project is, there's a problem out there, right? I'm WordPress, and I want to publish a blog. And I think that if we work together to make a blog platform, we can make a better blog platform, right? So if you have the problem of needing to publish blog post, come work with me and we'll make an awesome blog publishing platform, right? That's how open source works, not, I've made the best blog publishing platform in the world, please come fix some bugs, right? Like, no one wants to get behind that. People get involved with open source because there are shared challenges that they want to solve that they can't solve on their own. And so the rule behind this, the metric behind this, is that if you're happy with your code when you've shipped it, you've probably shipped too late. And this is kind of another way to state that ship 0.1, not ship 1.0, right? You want to get something really, really bad, really, really crappy, maybe just one step above I'm embarrassed by this code, out the door, and get people involved with that. Like, if you really want to get help from developers, the best way to do it is to troll them with really, really bad code. Like I am a terrible, terrible developer, and I know if I submit a pull request that's like, hey, I think I might be doing this wrong, and like submit that, 20 minutes later, I'll get like 15 pull requests telling me how to do it the right way. And so that's the idea. Start with the wrong answer, and you'll eventually get to the right answer. So before I get into external engagement, I'm going to pause there and do a quick stop for questions, for comments, for feedback. I think, yeah.
I just realized you've been Balter. I was told to go to your GitHub yesterday. Are these slides going to be online later?
Yes, they are online. Speakerdeck.com/Ben Balter. I'll also tweet them out if you follow me. Or follow me anyways, it helps my ego. We use chat ops at GitHub, and we have chat ops that track how many followers everyone has. And so it'll tell me, like, I need 10 more followers to beat my colleague John to get more followers than him. And then it graphs it out using Graphite. So if you could follow me, it would help my graphs, my stats.
Ben.Balter?
Speakerdeck.com/Ben Balter, and it's called Best Practices in Open Source or something like that. Or also tweet it out at Ben Balter on the Twitters. Was there a question too? Because if not, that was a good softball to start with. Yeah.
What about the non-developer approach to starting a project and using really disgusting wireframes?
Yes. And so I like that a lot. So data.gov did this, which I think is a great example of this. There's kind of two ways to approach this. There's this kind of misconception that GitHub is only for developers, and that the only way you can engage the community is to put code up there, right? GitHub is a social network for software developers. If you want to engage millennials, you go to Twitter. If you want to engage baby boomers, you go to Facebook. If you want to engage developers, you go to GitHub. And the idea there is you can have a repo and I'd recommend a lot of government agencies do this, that's just called feedback. Right? And say, even before you're at the wireframe stage, say, we currently have a website, we have agency.gov, it's probably terrible, because it's a government website, help make us better. And just start opening up issues for everything you see. And then maybe your next iteration of that is putting wireframes in the issues there. And again, this is not a coder doing all this. This can be a project manager, webmaster, whatever type person that just can speak English and respond to issues. And then when you get there, then start putting wireframes in place. So Data.gov did this, where before they even wrote a single line of code, the kind of designing team, the UX team, got together and started putting wireframes together for what they wanted the next iteration of Data.gov to look like. Put it up in a repo called github.com/gsa/data.gov, and that became eventually the repo where the code was, but there was a good couple months of iteration where there was no code in the repo. They started to get support from the developer community, to get feedback, to get interested in the project, and the wireframes became better as a result. So when they started writing their first line of code, not only did they have this really vibrant community already in place, but they were able to write better code because they were more informed by the larger conversation that happened before it. So definitely, you should, if you are in a position culturally to do it, you should start well before you even write your first line of code. Just give us feedback, start having the dialogue with the developers, and then whatever kind of collateral you have in your thought process. Even if you're eventually going to go do it closed source, if you're going to go out to a contractor, maybe put your SOW or your RFQ out on GitHub for feedback, saying, here's our feature list. We want these 17 things. It's going to be an API with XML and SAML, and you can only use a government email address. And people will probably give you feedback on that, and I think that would be very valuable. Is there one more question in the back? Yeah.
So I work outside the government, but I'd love to convince people within the city to make this organizational change. But I see it as a very big ask, right? Especially being so open, and it's a large change in processes. So how do I convince them essentially, and how do I start that?
So I'm hoping to try to compile some resources together to help you with that as much as we can. The short answer is, I would say, twofold. One is exposure. So if there's a city councilman that's a little bit geeky, that maybe doesn't have a BlackBerry and takes notes on an iPad, or she takes notes on her iPad, invite them to your next hackathon, your next brigade meeting, any sort of thing that just kind of expose them to show that open source is not a bunch of hippies with tie-dye laptops out on the West Coast, right? When you share code, it's not like sharing an illicit substance, passing around a little drum circle. It's how software is built today. And as much as you can manage that expectation of this is what modern software development looks like, and this is the way that any Fortune 500, any startup worth its venture capital funding would develop software, that will go a lot to show them that the risk profile of open source isn't what they think it is. And the second, as much as possible, to sit down with them, create a meeting with them if you kind of have that relationship, and say, let's create a GitHub account, and let's just go through and star some repositories, or find little things you can do to show them the value of GitHub. I use GitHub Pages for this a lot. It doesn't have to be GitHub. You can even do it the open source route and say hey, do you need a blog? Let's use WordPress. Let's use Drupal for their personal, here's pictures of me, what I eat for lunch kind of stuff. And just show them the value of open source and actually sit down and work through them. Again, if you're not a developer, I'm not talking deploying to Amazon or something like that, but just walking through and saying, well, so hey, look, here's an example of something that Code for Boston did. Here's an issue, and they asked for feedback, and here's all the great feedback they got. What if we did that for X initiative that's coming up, and we use this as a platform to get feedback? And it's GitHub is a gateway drug, and issues, actually more specifically, issues are a gateway drug, and Markdown files are a gateway drug to doing more, getting more involved with the open source community. So give them an avenue and hold their hand, literally sit down next to them and let them do it on your laptop, or help them with their laptop, and let them dip their toe in the water in a safe way. That if they screw up and they're oh, I accidentally closed the issue, no one's going to care. CNN's not going to report about that. Anything else? Yeah.
What about IP? You mentioned earlier, if people are contributing work to this, you can even kind of go back to just working on it by yourself. And then what happens to rights with regards to GitHub?
Yeah, so on the federal level, everything that the government creates is public domain. You're asking if the agency wants to make a closed source. Is that what you're asking? Or if a citizen wants to make a closed source?
Either, yeah.
So most open source projects, well, every open source project will have an open source license. The most popular license in government and in open source is the MIT license, and after that, probably the Apache license. If you want more information on this, go to choosealicense.com, which is a website that we maintain to answer this kind of question and demystify the difference between them. But the license fundamentally says, this project is open source, you can do anything you want with it, just don't sue me. That's essentially what the license says. And that allows that if I contribute to the project, I contribute under the terms of that license. So if I'm a citizen and I contribute to a government project, the government could theoretically, the government legality aside, take my code and make it closed source because I gave them permission as part of my contribution. Or if it's a government project, I can then build a business on that, which is what, as civic hackers, we want the next Uber to be built on government data. And so if they take the code and make it closed source, that would be a really, really good thing. Like, ideally, I'd like them to contribute it back, but if their business model requires them to take that government code and make it closed source, so be it. The only caveat to all that is there's two licenses, the GPL and the AGPL, which are what are called copyleft. I'm getting really in the weeds here, but are copyleft licenses, which basically say that if you contribute to this, if you distribute any changes to this project, they have to be open source as well. With the AGPL adding the additional consideration that if you host a service using this code, that service must be open source. So as long as the project is not GPL or LGPL, you're fine closed sourcing it, is the short answer. And make sure to put a license in your code. If you're in the federal government, it might have to be public domain, which simplifies things even further. But MIT, Apache, chooselicense.com. Okay, so external engagement. So I talked all this entire time about what happens inside the firewall, inward facing. I got five tips to close things up on the kind of secrets on the external facing stuff. The first, and we kind of touched on this a little bit before, is to expand the definition of stakeholders, right? We often think of contributors to an open source project as being developers. GitHub is a developer platform, right? That's not the case, right? You should really start thinking about this whole big kind of Venn diagram of potential contributors to your project, both inside the firewall and outside the firewall, right? If you're a brigade, obviously you have your brigade members, including developers, designers, UX experts. You have users, right? Users can open up issues with bugs they find. But then even inside the agency, you have kind of the executive stakeholder, you have some sort of a program manager, the press. You know, people that might want to write about it, and start thinking. And that's what I want to talk about: subject matter experts, right? So start thinking about all the potential people that might contribute to your project in different ways, and start again optimizing the. When I say developer experience, optimizing the open source experience for all those kind of personas. If you're familiar with the idea of like agile personas, make agile personas for all these guys in your mind or all these gals in your mind, and start saying, okay, if I am a veteran user of this project, I don't know code, but I use this project every day, what kind of needs might I have? I'll probably have FAQ, I might have a question about installation, I might have a question about where to submit bugs, so start thinking through that experience. And there's lots of all sorts of different opportunities to contribute. On the far left side, top left, for kind of like casual users, kick the tires. Does it work, right? We just released version 1.0 and the background is now green. Is that actually true? If it's not, please open up an issue. And you kind of go through all the different ways to contribute, fleshing out documentation, providing feedback on proposed changes, all the way down to speaking about your project, right? That's a really, really great value that Code for America can add to government projects. Just telling the story of why this project is awesome and getting other developers involved, all the way down to like recruiting other developers. So if you limit yourself just to thinking that stakeholders, that people that might contribute are developers in the private sector, then you're significantly limiting what the people you're optimizing for, and then as a result, the community and the vibrancy of your project. The second is to be the hub of a community and encourage spokes around that. And the way I like to explain that to government is that you are the host of the internet's most boring cocktail party, right? So if you're the host of a physical cocktail party, what would you do? You stand someplace roughly near the door. If it's me, probably near the bar or the food. But you stand near the door, and when people come in, you say, welcome. You say, oh, hey, I'm really glad you were able to make it. Do you know Susan? I think you might get along with Susan really, really well. Or like, oh, hey, welcome, you just had a kid, congratulations, go over, talk to those people, right? And so you kind of have a couple different roles. You greet them as they are, first you invite them, obviously, but you greet them as they kind of are new members to your community. You connect them with other members of your community, and you make sure that they have the resources they need. Oh, if you need to hang up your coat checks right over here, bathrooms over there, bars over there, right? Your job is not necessarily to be the one constantly eating the food and throwing back all the drinks and saying witty things. Your job is to make sure that everyone at your party has the ability to do that. You are there to enable their ability to contribute. And one of the ways you do that is stealing kind of a meme from traditional software engineering, is that non-blocking is better than blocking, right? We say this in software engineering to say that if you have a process, one process shouldn't have to wait for another process to complete. They should both be able to kind of work asynchronously. In open source, it's the same way. I should shouldn't have to fill out paperwork in order to contribute to the project. I should be able to submit a pull request. You should be able to review it. Maybe paperwork might be required at some point, but at all steps of the process, try not to require human intervention. Optimize for the stereotypical developer coding at 3 a.m. with like Doritos crumbs and Mountain Dew cans all over his keyboard, right? If that guy or gal can't contribute to your project because they need to dial in at 9 a.m. to your conference call, they're not going to be able to contribute. Another kind of the way that you do that is you be a matchmaker, right? If you put out a data set, you have the opportunity to connect subject matter experts, people that really know that data set really well. If you're the FCC, maybe it's where radio towers are. So there's people that know radio towers really, really well, but they don't know Python, they don't know Ruby, they don't know Go. And so if you can be kind of that matchmaker and introduce people and say like, oh, mentioned this guy who is an expert in radio towers, he might be able to answer your question, all of a sudden you've just empowered that developer to do a lot more things, and you can kind of back away from that conversation and you're no longer blocking it. So practically the way you get there is you need to minimize one-to-one interactions. The default way in government to interact with a government open source project, a website, if you have a question about it, a data set, is emailing anonymous inbox at agency.gov, right? Maybe there are humans at the other end, maybe no one checks that because the person who used to check that left, right? There's no way to know, and the problem with that is you're gonna be answering questions again and again. Is this column month, day, year, or year, month, day, right? And so you keep answering that question again and again. That's not very efficient. Everyone knows that in today's technology age, if you have a problem, the first thing you do is you Google it. If you get an error message, you Google it. If you have a problem with your iPhone, you Google it. Pushing things into issues, into repos, makes things Googleable. So all of a sudden I say, FCC radio tower dataset, month, day, year, month, day, I'm gonna find that issue, and I've just got an answer without requiring a blocking operation on the part of the agency. But that has then some additional kind of benefits. All of a sudden things start getting URLs. So if someone does email anonymous inbox at agency.gov, I don't have to type out the answer every time. I just send them to an issue, and all of a sudden they have the entire pedigree, the entire history of who asked that question, how it was answered, why a decision was made, and linking out to relevant issues. And last, so then that way you can answer questions once, or even better if you can get to the state where you actually don't answer questions, because someone opens up an issue on your repository, and someone else from the community who's already faced that same problem says, oh, I parsed the data set last night, I had the same problem, turns out it's year, month, day, not month, day, year, here you go, close the issue. Right? And that's kind of the place where you really want to get. And that's why you're the host of the cocktail party, just kind of making those connections. The third is to minimize friction. Friction is a metric that we use at GitHub, both internally and in terms of our open source project, which I would define as the time it takes to go from I want to contribute to I have contributed. Right? So if there's an open source project and I find a bug in it, how long does it take me to like actually do the thing it needs to do, right? So first I need to find out what is this thing? What is this project intended to do? Okay, what language is it written in? Is it written in Ruby? Great, I know Ruby, I can respond, I can help this in Ruby. Do I need a lawyer, right? Is it this giant like legalese thing that says this is a government project and you will go to jail and the FBI will come after you if you contribute, right? What does the documentation look like? And then this is the big one for me is how do I bootstrap a local development environment? How much meta work is involved with contributing? So if I find a typo in your website, okay, so actually correcting the typo to change TEH to THE, 30 seconds probably, right? By the time I boot up my environment and everything. How long does it take for me to install PHP, to set up a MySQL server, to get WordPress installed, all the kind of things to seed the database? How long does all that take, and how much is that relative to the thing I want to do? If the time it takes to do the setup is longer than the thing I want to do, there's a high chance I won't do it. And then once I submit my improvement, what kind of meta work is involved with that, right? How long does it take you to review the improvement? What's that process look like? Does it linger for 6 months before finally somebody remembers that they have an open source project that they need to maintain? And so try to think about friction as much as possible, minimize friction, again, going back to the idea of the developer experience. The fourth is the idea of decentralizing government, right? Governance. That's your own thing, you don't have to put it up. So it's decentralizing governance. And the idea there is that you don't need a meeting to merge a pull request. I know that there are government agencies that every week they have a scheduled regular meeting on Wednesdays that say, okay, we're now going to have the open source project meeting. Let's print out all the pull requests and let's create an agenda. Okay, now on to pull request number 7. Kevin, can you reply with a thumbs up emoji to pull request number 7, please? Great, action item done, right? That's how government traditionally works, but that's not how open source works. You don't need a meeting to go through all that process. The whole idea is to adopt those constraints so you can do things asynchronously. You don't need a meeting. You don't need a suit to merge a pull request, right? You don't need to be the highest paid person in your part of the organization, right? As much as possible, you should push authority down to developers, to subject matter experts, to people, empower them to make the decisions that they should be making without kind of approval, right? If I submit a pull request to github.com/whitehouse/petitions, the White House petitions platform, if I wanted to submit a proposal to deport Justin Bieber back to Canada, it's not like in the president's daily briefing, he's like, sir, we have a pull request to the petitions repository. We need your approval on this, right? Do you think we should change? No, it's the president doesn't get involved with that. It's some developer, and he or she knows the code best. As much as possible, try to push things and give authority to the people closest to the code, whether developers or subject matter experts. And there's kind of a corollary to that, is that you need to be a member of the community in order to participate in it, right? If you're just some sort of bureaucrat and you kind of aren't really familiar with the day-to-day goings on the project, because you don't really consider yourself a member of the community, it gets a lot harder. So a lot of times you need to have a role within your organization who's not necessarily a community manager, but at least someone whose day-to-day job is to worry about the health of the project in terms of responding to issues and performing code reviews and accepting or rejecting pull requests and caring about the long-term planning and making sure all that is available to external open source developers, right? If there needs to be a counterbalance to the traditional kind of inertia in government of doing things very synchronously and very closed off to the outside world. And the last thing is to encourage contributors. As I said when I started out, the right to contribute to an open source project is assumed in the open source world. It's not assumed in government, right? Open source developers have been bit by very bad experiences of submitting pull requests to open source projects and never hearing back, or like having really bad code and really bad experiences. So as silly as it is to say, it's important to let developers know that you want contributors. That's a line in your README that says, please contribute to our project. If you would like to contribute, here's the instructions how to do it. And go out of your way to encourage them. Anytime someone submits a pull request for the first time, thank you very much, thumbs up emoji, muscle symbol, USA flag, right? Show them, like if you are the CIO of your state or your city and someone in high school or college submits a pull request to make a change and the CIO of the state says, thank you very much for helping us, this is awesome, like that goes a long way to make sure that they're going to contribute again and again. So in practice, that means documenting how to contribute, making sure the technical requirements are explained, how to run the project locally, all in your README on a daily basis in terms of providing constructive feedback and support. If someone submits a bad pull request, don't say, this is not the quality of pull request we're looking for, we can't merge it, thank you very much, goodbye. Work with them to get the pull request to where it needs to go. I said express gratitude by commenting as you're merging. And then as you're going forward, you can put automated technical systems in place to make sure that this all happens without your intervention. CI, continuous integration, adding Travis to your repo, right? Then all of a sudden, if I'm not as versed as a technical contributor, and I need to review pull requests, as long as I see that green light, I know the website isn't going to crash. I can merge it with a little bit more confidence. If I'm an external developer, I see the red light. I get immediate feedback without having to wait for the agency to comment. Everyone familiar with the concept of continuous integration in Travis? It's just automated tests that run every time someone submits a proposed change to your repository, provide feedback on whether the proposed change break things that are expected to work previously. And then one of my favorite things that is very strong in the GitHub culture, and I'm starting to see go on elsewhere, is to minimize that friction through shared tooling. And what I mean by that is if you go to any GitHub repository, both closed source or open source, repositories created by GitHub, the company, we have a script folder. And you'll always find script setup, script bootstrap, script server, and script test. Regardless if it's Node or Go or Ruby or PHP, I know I can go into any GitHub project. So let's say I find a typo in one of our internal apps. We have an app called Team, which is like a blog, right? I find a typo in the Team app. I know I can go git clone, github/team. I have no idea what language it's in. I say script bootstrap. If it's Ruby, it'll run bundle install. If it's Node, it'll run npm init. I don't have to read any documentation. I don't have to think through all that stuff. It does it all for me. I go get a cup of coffee. I make my change. I run script test. Tests are green. I can submit my pull request. I can run script server, again, regardless of language. I can run it locally. So provide that experience for your external developers and say, hey, you want to test this project locally? Clone it, run script bootstrap. You can test it locally. And as much as possible, absorb the complexity for your external contributors contributors for them. There's a great blog post on the GitHub engineering blog about this. We call them jokingly internally scripts to rule them all. If you go grab that. So that's all I prepared. I wanted to purposely leave some, I know we have a little bit of time left, to leave some time for questions if we have any. And I'm glad to go into more detail. I can go into the weeds about licensing or anything that I mentioned here and so much more. But I definitely did, I know this is the kind of topic that has opinions and has questions. I want to make this as interactive as possible. So I saw that you had a question? Or?
I was just going to say, script bootstrap, the mentioning that exists goes into the hacking, the README, right?
Yes. So in the README, you'd have how to contribute to the project, right? And the instructions would say, to contribute to this project, fork the project, create a descriptively named feature branch, and make your change. If you want to test your changes locally, the steps are script bootstrap, make your change, script test. And the idea there is I don't know Node, right? I don't know Go. And you just run this one script that will install all the dependencies. Think about it mathematically, right? If the normal process of installing Ruby and Node or whatever I need to run my project, if it's a larger project, setting up the MySQL server and seeding it with test data takes 30 minutes from start to finish, right? Or maybe 15 minutes to make it a little bit more realistic. And if it takes me an hour to build that script to do all that in an automated way, as long as 4 people use script bootstrap to set up the repository, mathematically you've broken even. By the time you're doing the 5th person, you've just created more developer time that give people the opportunity to contribute to your project. And also it's just a nice thing to do. It's kind of going back to that cocktail party metaphor. It's the welcome mat. It's the let me take your coat for you, rather than being like, there might be a coat rack over there someplace, build it yourself, right? And so trying to make it easier for them. Yeah.
So say I have like an Android client, and then I have like a backend server, and I'm part of like the code for like a brigade organization. And so there's all these different projects, and then there's like the Android app for my project, and then there's the backend server. And how do I organize that? Like you told me long-term plans and stuff that are useful for that.
Sure, I apologize, I forgot. For the previous question, the question was, where does script bootstrap go for the recording and all that kind of fun stuff. So the question was, you have an Android project, and that has an Android client, right? And you have a backend that's written in Java or whatever it is. And how do you organize those relative to each other?
Yeah.
I would recommend you have an organization, and they're both just individual repositories within that organization. And probably in the documentation they link to each other and say where they are. The nice thing about GitHub issues is that you can cross-link them very easily. So if there are concerns that probably affect one another. So if someone opens an issue on the Android project and says, I hit this button and I get an error message, and they open the issue on the Android side, it's very easy to close that and open an issue on the server side and cross-link them. The reason that I would suggest that is because generally speaking, they're going to have different setup environments, right? So that kind of strip bootstrap, which one would that do if you ran it? Or in the instructions to be like, here's the instruction to set up the server, here's the instruction. It's just a general kind of separations of concerns, computer engineering standpoint. But more from, again, going back to the idea of that developer or open source experience, is that if I'm an Android developer and I care about the Android side of the application, I can follow the Android side of the application. I know where to open up issues. If all of a sudden you start having Java code or Node or whatever it might be, all of a sudden it gets a little bit more confusing for me as a first-time contributor to contribute. I like to think in my head of someone who's maybe they're freshman in college who just took their first computer science class, who's really excited about algorithms and sees a way to improve something. How do you optimize the experience for them? And the less code you can have in the repo, the more specific it can be, the tighter the issues are to one another, makes it a better experience for that first-time contributor. So the person that's contributed 15 times in the past, you don't need to help them out. They know how to contribute, so you optimize for that first-time contributor. What's the escape velocity necessary, the amount of energy necessary to get them from potential contributor to actual contributor, and optimize for that in all situations. Yeah.
Multiple services trying to talk to each other, there's a backend, there's someone, is simply have a server up and running which allows them to connect to a kind of a test port, so that all they have to do is the Android side. And they can connect up and everything else is there and ready to use, and they don't actually need to build it in their own environment.
Yeah, so the suggestion was if you have that kind of client-server relationship, to have a dev server sitting out there someplace that if I just want to test the Android app, I can do as many write requests, as many read requests, and it won't affect production data, and it makes it, again, a better experience. You're minimizing the friction, you're minimizing the meta work, because if I know Android, I don't have to also know whatever language the backend server is written in. Anything else? Does anybody, so this was kind of my list that I came up with looking through different government stories and helping out different government customers. Are there kind of stories from your own experience? I know that brigade captains kind of, I'm sure, have some sort of war stories. These were my tips. Are there any other tips that you would recommend that you've seen, anti-patterns that you've seen in government, that you'd recommend that people should take back with them? I got them all on the first try. That's amazing. Yeah.
I don't have a tip or a question.
Yeah.
I apologize if it's a novice waste of time type of question.
No, by all means.
But if you wanted to sort of delegate the approval of pull requests to someone with a better understanding of the code submissions, do you have a mechanism in GitHub for that, for a non-developer like myself that wants to try and make a project, but sort of wants to have partners that can manage some of that, because I won't understand the changes they're making?
Sure. So the question was, how do you delegate developer responsibility to a developer in terms of like practically within the repository? So there's kind of two sides to that. I'm going to talk about the technical way to do that and then the cultural way to do that. So the technical way to do that is you'll have an organization with teams, and so you would be an administrator on the repository, and then any developers, whether they're employees of the agency, employees of a contractor, or people from the community that have been contributing enough that you start to trust them, right? This natural phenomenon is open source. Is you start submitting pull requests, they start getting accepted. Eventually you say, you don't need me to review these anymore. You can start reviewing other pull requests. So internal, external, or kind of open source community, grant them read-write access to the repository. So they have the ability to review pull requests, merge pull requests, and empower them through tooling, CI, through guidelines, right? This is what our code standard is, and make sure that they have all the potential resources they need to meet your expectations, right? So if you say our coding standard is we use the Facebook PHP coding standard, right? Like just make sure that's in the repository and that expectation is clear. But that doesn't mean they can't, like policy questions come up in government open source projects, right? So if going back to the idea of the White House petitions platform, the We the People platform, maybe you delegate down to a developer to read changes to PHP that optimize database connections, right? That's obviously something that a developer should be the expert on and should be deciding on. But then maybe someone submits a pull request that says, is everyone familiar with the White House We the People petitions platform? If I use that as an example, I submit petitions and they vote on, okay. Someone says, hey, when I submit a petition, if the White House says no to it, 20 days later the petition should open back up again automatically, right? That's a policy question. And so the solution there is to make sure expectations are set, that people have areas of responsibility. So just as if I'm a developer, I'm not going to make design decisions. If I'm a policy person, I shouldn't be making developer decisions, and vice versa. If I'm a developer, I shouldn't be making policy decisions. So I don't know that I would necessarily go as far in the README and say, if it's a policy question, Bob decides. It's a developer question, Susan decides. But to have kind of expectations among contributors, among I'm trying to think of collaborators, right? Of people that have write access to the repository, that they know their areas of responsibility, and there's enough communication that you can feel confident that they will have the, again, going back to the idea of technical versus cultural constraints, they will have the technical ability to merge that pull request that says that, it automatically tweets out every petition that the White House rejects, but you're confident that they don't have the cultural ability to do that, because they'll lose their developer status, and you know that that's what they don't want. And the other side of that is also, you probably manage the deploys, or the deploy is probably a separate process. So even if something gets into the code base that's objectionable, the great thing about Git is there's Git revert. And actually now on all pull requests, there's a big revert button on every pull request. And so you do your code review on the pull request, but I like to say there's no kind of security vulnerability until you deploy. So you can have bad code on master, but as long as you review that, you review all the changes that were made before it was deployed, it doesn't actually affect production. It doesn't actually affect how the application works. So long answer, but hope that helps. Yeah.
I'm sure you have this, but I haven't really searched that. What's a good resource for non-technical types to get into the GitHub workflow? I mean, you show some new people, even Markdown is a high barrier to entry for some people.
Yeah, so the question was, what's the best way to get non-technical types to give them an introduction to GitHub? So I have a blog post that I can tweet out alongside the slides as well. If you go to it, it's ben.balter.com, and it's called 12 Tools for Non-Developers or something like that. The idea is, GitHub is intimidating by perception, but not necessarily in practicality, right? If you give, let's assume that someone, so the barriers to entry are creating an account, which means you go to github.com/signup, enter a username and password and an email address. Right? If you've ever signed up for any service online, that's not a hard thing. It's intimidating mentally because you're like, well, I'm making a big commitment here. What if GitHub is a bad person or something like that, right? There's a mental barrier there, but technically it's very easy to do. And then in terms of contributing, the actual issue thing has developer-y words on it, right? It has merge, it has milestone, it has things that sound intimidating, but practically it's title. And body, or if they're commenting on something, it's just a thread of comments and there's a comment box. If they've been to any blog, it's probably a similar experience. So a lot of that is just holding their hand through the process, but practically, you can build an interface on top of GitHub that doesn't look like GitHub, but is GitHub and provides a GitHub experience. So I have a handful of little tiny 10, 15 line Sinatra Heroku apps. One of them that comes to mind is called Comment Card, that I know 18F among other folks were looking at using for a while, the kind of startup within GSA that says, okay, you don't have to know GitHub, you don't have to know issues. Here's our website. If you have any feedback on our website, here's a white screen that has 2 boxes on it, title and description. All you do is type in title and description, hit submit, and it takes care of everything. They don't realize in the background they're actually submitting an issue and they're creating a whole forum and they're getting subscribed to that. But you can provide little interfaces like that make it easier for non-developers. Similar to that, I have a little app on Heroku called Word to Markdown, where you just drag and drop a Word file and it makes it into Markdown. Markdown is kind of the lingua franca of open source, is how most documentation is worked. And firing up Word or your desktop word processor is the most often way that any thing in government starts, whatever it is. And so rather than disrupting their workflow and saying, we're going to change the way you work, say, keep working the same way you are. We're going to build this one additional step that will take the way you currently work and bridge it to the way that hopefully you can work one day. And once they get kind of past that intimidating factor, they'll start to get over that. But if you go to ben.balter.com, it's 12 tools to help non-developers use GitHub or something like that. I can probably pull it up while I answer the next question. Yeah?
You think we could do that for Excel spreadsheets as well?
Yes, it would be very possible. So GitHub, the question is, could you do that for Excel spreadsheets? GitHub automatically renders CSVs if you commit any CSV file to GitHub. It'll just show it as a CSV. To go from Excel to CSV, I imagine it would be possible. I have a long flight back, so we'll see what happens. I don't know if I have internet or not. Yeah.
It's on your front page. It's January 11th.
There's another. There we go. So here's a handful of tools. Word to Markdown, Markdown to PDF, right? So if you're like, hey, can you send me the documentation? And you send someone a URL to a Markdown file, like, I don't know what this is, right? And you send them a PDF, they're like, this is an enterprise-grade PDF. I can use this PDF now, right? Comment Card is one I talked about. Problem Child, which is also kind of another example of this. You don't have to use these particular apps. All of them are just proof of concepts, like 10 lines. Problem Child, it makes a RESTful API for submitting GitHub issues. So you can make any sort of HTML form, right? It could be, submit a suggestion of a restaurant near our office, or whatever it might be. And it's just, basic HTML. When you hit post on that, it'll actually open up an issue in the back end, include all the different things, or just bullet points in the body of the issue. GitHub form, yeah, so I won't go into the other ones, but there's lots of different ways, and all these are just examples, just quick proof of concept examples of building an interface on top of GitHub, on top of the tools of the open source community that make it less intimidating, that kind of get rid of the sidebar. The other way you can possibly do it is use a Chrome extension or Firefox extension that just uses CSS to hide all the noise on the page. But I think personally, I think it's more of an intellectual barrier, a mental barrier than a practical barrier. And we're just about time, but any last dying questions? Like I said, I'll put out the slides and I'll put out a link to this if it's helpful. But well, sweet. Well, thanks for coming out. Like I said, my full-time job is helping government agencies and helping civic hackers be successful at what they do. I'm a developer myself, and I love geeking about open source, if you can't tell. So I'm glad to stick around and answer any questions. I think I had my email address up on there, but it's just government@github.com is my email address. If there's any way that I can be helpful anytime, feel free to reach out, and I'll also be hanging out at the GitHub booth. We have lots of stickers and Git cheat sheets and Markdown cheat sheets, which are really great to passive-aggressively put on your coworker's desk. Be like, I'm not saying you're bad at Git, I'm just saying, next time you need a rebase, read this, you know? So feel free to use us as a resource because we are here to support you and to support the community. So thank you very much.